Right, sometimes we want to make population projections, and they're really difficult to do. In one of your activities this week, you will see that you're going to make some population projections for different states using census data, different states in the United States. Population projections are really difficult to do. They're just estimates. And often we use fertility rates. We look at old data to try to see kind of where communities are going to be in the future, whether it's our local community, our states, or our country. Okay, and this allows us to do, again, some planning or some estimates of what our needs are going to be in the future. Some companies use this kind of information besides the government. Insurance companies use deaths at each age to determine life insurance rates. So they're interested in kind of like looking at projections and, you know, what is the life expectancy? How long are people going to live? And they base rates on that information. Okay, so that industry absolutely uses this type of information and does their best to project out into the future what is coming. But again, it's very difficult to do. And again, it's only an estimate of what we can make of it. All right, when we think about calculating some growth rates of population, we're going to talk about rate of growth. We're going to talk about doubling time. But just keep in mind that when we think about our well over 7 billion people on the planet right now, when we think about estimating currently, what we think is by 2050, which is only, 35 years from now or so, we are looking at possibly having about 9.6 billion people on the planet. And the estimate is by 2100, about 85 years from now, there'll be 11 billion people. Okay, if we continue to grow at the rates that we are now, that is a huge deal. And we have to kind of figure out how we're going to handle that, or if we're going to try to curb that growth. All right, when we think of the rate of growth of a population, we can calculate that by taking the crude birth rate, subtracting the crude death rate, and that will give us the natural increase or decrease in a population per 1,000 people per year. Okay, if we divide that by 10, we can get the growth rate. So I give you an example here of, if we have 50 people born, we have 35 people that die, we end up with 15. That's our natural increase. Okay, if it was reversed, we would have a natural decrease. Okay, if it was 35 minus 15, we'd have negative growth. When we divide that 15 that results, we divide that by 10 to get the growth rate. That is 1.5%. And you might say, well, that seems like a pretty low rate. If I had a 1.5% interest rate on an account, that doesn't seem like a very great percentage rate. Okay? But when we think about growth rates of populations, if we start out with a very large population like China, like I said, 1.4 billion people there, and we have a 1.5% growth rate. That is, even at that low rate, when we're dealing with a large number that you're taking the percentage of, it's a huge addition to the population. Okay, we also can calculate what we call the doubling time, the number of years it takes for a population to double. And you can do doubling time with different, to calculate the doubling time of different things. Like say you were going to, you wanted to see how long is it going to take for your money in your bank account to double. You could take that and do the similar calculation and project out how many years it's going to take at that interest rate for that amount of money to double. Okay, so in our scenario here, okay, we have our percent rate of growth. We calculated it to be 1.5%. When we calculate doubling time, we always use a constant number of 70, and we divide by that percent rate of growth. So you'll see there that we have 70 divided by the 1.5% from the above equation. And when we do that division, we get 47 years. Okay, 47 years. They say, oh, well, that takes a long time. So for our population, okay, to double. Okay, 47 years, so in 47 years we'd have 100 people. Okay, let's just say our population up there is 100. Okay, so, all right, great. Now, the issue is when you're talking about China at 1.4 billion people or so, if they were growing at a rate of 1.5%, they could double their population to 2.8 billion people in less than 50 years. That's where we get concerned, that countries that have huge populations and they have high fertility rates, we're going to run into a problem where their populations could double in a relatively short amount of time. That's a huge deal. Unfortunately, China and India, with the world's largest population, both having over 1 billion people in each of them, they are both growing rapidly, and they have the huge populations on top of that. Okay, so let's move forward and kind of talk more about what's happening in our industrialized countries and our industrializing countries, or our developed countries and our developing countries. All right, we talk about our rich countries as our developed countries, or our high-income countries. And our developed world has about 20% of the world's population, but approximately 80% of the wealth on the planet. Okay, so you can kind of see this discrepancy where there's only a small fraction, about a fifth of the world's population in the developed world, but most of the money is there. All right, so we can have things that other countries do not have. Okay, we fall into this category. All right, we have a significant impact on the environment because of our sheer affluence. Okay, when we talk about our poor developing countries, the issue that stems from those countries is that there's just so many people, that because there's so many people, they put a high demand on the earth. All right, so when we think about our developed countries, like I said, the impact that we have is due to our affluence, because we do have the money to do the things that we want to do. Okay, again, talking about our whole country, or all of the developed world. Okay, we think about global pollution, okay, our vehicles, okay, how much waste we produce. The U.S. is often called the throwaway society. We waste 40% of our food sources here in the United States. So we put a high demand on those resources. We consume a lot, and we waste a lot of resources. Okay, we say that a person, basically in the United States, we put a 20 times higher demand on Earth's resources than the poor developing countries. So as much as we think of, okay, there's so many people in the developing world that put a strain on the Earth, we put a huge strain on the Earth because we demand so much more. Okay, and the estimate is that we put a 20 times higher demand on Earth's resources than the developing world. In your first homework assignment, I asked you to basically go through and figure out what your ecological footprint was. And I think we all kind of came across that it's way higher than someone in the developing world. Okay? But again, on either side of it, whether we're in the developed world or the developing world, we put a huge strain on resources. It's just because of different reasons. We do it because we can. Okay, we do it because we can. We have the ability to, own cars and use energy. We have, our laptops and our cell phones and all these types of things that put a big demand on the earth, and we get rid of a lot of waste that we say we want a new one, we want a new phone, we want a new this, we want a new that, and we discard the old one. Okay, so we are not too conservative on that front. All right, when we talk about the developing world, or the middle to low income countries, they have the opposite. They have about 80% of the world's population with only about 20% of the wealth. And the concern here is that most population growth occurs in the developing world. Okay, and we'll talk about that. Like, why is that just staggering, the increase of people in the developing world. Like, what is causing that overpopulation there? Okay, like I said before, the impact from the developing countries on the environment is really due to their sheer amount of people. Okay, if there are, so many people, using rivers as a toilet or throwing their garbage in rivers, over harvesting or deforesting, okay, degrading farmland and abandoning it, burning fuel wood, okay, all of these types of things that we think about, maybe we were where we were a few hundred years ago. Okay, like I said, in the developing world, this is a big concern because the fertility rates here are between 3 and 6. All right, and that makes the population just explode. So what are some of the impacts that the developing world has on the environment and some social impacts? When we think about the developed world, okay, I'm not going to address that now because pretty much everything we talk about after human population is going to come from, a lot of it's going to come from the developed world. When we talk about environmental quality and our impacts on it, when we talk about energy use, all right, we're really going to be having conversations about what we're doing in the developed world, okay, and a little bit about the developing world. But I want to focus on the developing world because we're talking about overpopulation and the excessive amount of people on the planet and what kind of strain that puts on ecosystems and resources. Okay, so the first thing I want to pop up here is increased cultivation and subdividing farms. When we think about resources in the developing world, we are concerned about not having enough land. Okay, we're concerned about deforestation and the use of firewood as their main energy source. Okay, if you're using firewood, you're cutting down trees. Okay, that is changing habitats, that is affecting biodiversity. All right, it is changing the dynamic of a forested ecosystem. Okay, and that is their main source of power, is wood. Okay, burning that organic matter. Obviously, that leads to issues with air quality, of course, and if it's not being replanted, it is a long-term issue. All right, continuous planting, no crop rotation, causes a lot of degradation of land and can cause soil erosion. All right, so when we think about sustainable agriculture like we practice here in the United States, we rotate our crops. We understand that, you can't just keep pulling the same nutrients out of the water season after, out of the soil season after season. Okay, you have to rotate your crops. You can't grow the same thing on it all the time. All right, so we rotate our crops. We don't continuously plant in the same place all the time. We give it a break. And this keeps our soil good for the long term. Okay, when you are just really trying to feed your family, really you're just trying to grow food so you can eat. So often this leads to, really not functioning sustainably and causes the soil to become degraded. And if that soil becomes degraded and barren, it can lead to a lot of erosion. Okay, in addition, we have overgrazing. So again, not really regulating where animals are feeding, and that can lead to, again, depletion of resources there. Okay, we have lands that aren't well suited to agriculture being converted to agriculture. So we see where we have forested land that may not be well suited for agriculture being converted into ag lands. All right, and if it is, because it's not that suitable, it can become unusable in a short amount of time, just a handful of years, like between 3 and 5 years. So once it becomes unsuitable to be used, it's abandoned and a new area is deforested and used. So basically converting lands that aren't well suited leads to degrading of those lands over and over and over again. Okay, and that just, again, destroys habitats. We lose biodiversity, all of those types of things. Okay, in addition, we have some social impacts. We have people like leaving these rural environments and headed to cities, okay, thinking there's more opportunity there. But often we see slum conditions form there because the opportunity doesn't keep up with the influx of people coming in. There might not be jobs, and when we have a lot of people in unsanitary conditions, we get outbreaks of cholera, other diseases. We get sewage, contamination in our drinking water. It can lead to all kinds of issues in those cities. Okay, so people move there for opportunity, but it's not always there for them, and it leads to a lot of problems when we have a lot of people in a small space crammed together without, really any jobs or opportunity. Okay, this can lead to illicit activities. Obviously, people turning to drugs for income to make more money. We see, for example, in class, we'll hopefully watch a video about illegal gold mining in the Amazon and the impacts that's having on the environment, and basically people trying to make a living and make some money. We also see poaching or the pet trade being second to drugs in making money. Okay, obviously when we see poaching, it can lead to extinction. Basically taking animals for different purposes, and whether it's just, for fun, game hunting, big game hunting, or it can be for clearly their furs or their tusks. There's a resurgence of the ivory from tusks from white and black rhinos and elephants. So there's been kind of a resurgence of that. And countries that are in the developing world don't always have the resources to battle these trades, okay, the drug trade and the illegal pet trade. So it's really challenging for them, and it can really have a huge environmental impact and a huge social impact. Okay, you also see people leaving countries. Okay, we know this. They leave their countries for better lives. We have people coming, from Mexico, people coming from Central America. There's a, crisis down there where people are emigrating away from their countries and trying to immigrate into developed countries. We see issues in the Middle East with people trying to escape war-torn countries and go into the developed world, trying to escape their countries for a better life elsewhere. And people have been doing this for a very long time, and it's still happening today. Okay, and that impacts, what's left in their country, and it impacts everybody on our planet. Okay, finally, we often see impoverished women and children. Okay, people who have been abandoned, they're desperate. It's not that uncommon in the developing world to see stray children, okay, children who have lost both their parents, okay, or have been abandoned. So they are really the most vulnerable in the society. Okay, we see people, turning to stealing, prostitution, child labor, selling children, all of these types of situations. And the reason why women and children are often more vulnerable is because often women have many children. Again, something could have happened to their husband. They don't have the same kind of medical care and all the things that we talked about. And they often are illiterate. Okay, so we'll kind of talk about that in a little bit, about, the lack of education, and how we see, that, we see illiteracy rates in the developing world between 50 and 70%, okay, of women. Okay, that is very high, and it makes women more vulnerable because they can't participate, they can't get jobs. Okay, they don't have the skills to work outside the home. Okay, and that really leaves them very vulnerable. And of course, children, we see people selling children, and having certainly child labor. We know about concerns about sweatshops and all those types of things in the developed world. So it is a really big concern.